sent her a note, and she's willing to do this for us. So I really appreciate it. She's a postdoc at the Center for Informed Public at the other University of Washington. And my daughter has a master's also from University of Washington in the Library School of Information. She has a PhD from Annenberg at USC, University of Southern California, and she also has some credentials from another continent. She has a BA and an MA from Cambridge in social and political science. And she has a second master's in political communication from the Goldsmith College at the University of London. So these are some amazing credentials, and those have been honored and recognized by the number of publications she's also been involved with in publishing all kinds of things to do with communication and technology communication. So, Rachel, thank you. Welcome. Take it away, and I appreciate you joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Just give me 1 second and I will share my screen. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. Feel free to talk to me through the chat, and I have a couple of sort of links to share along the way that I'll put in the chat too, just to sort of keep us on the same track. But yeah, thank you for that lovely introduction. As introduced, I am Rachel Moran. I am a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Washington's Center for an Informed Public. We were recently formed. I think we're about to celebrate our 3rd anniversary here at the University of Washington Center. And we have a strategic mission, which is to promote an informed society, strengthen democratic discourse, and resist strategic misinformation. So it's been a busy few years, as you can imagine, for the past couple of election cycles, and with the ongoing pandemic, we've been tracking sort of the spread of misinformation online and its impact offline as well. And so I'm going to talk today a little bit about mis and disinformation, what it is, some of the kind of phrases and the technical terms that we use within academia to describe it. And then I wanted to talk about a couple of projects that I've been working on here at the center that look at misinformation on social media and how it sort of spreads, and how also it's making some people a lot richer, but also a lot poorer in terms of our media literacy and our ability to sort of have shared conversations. So as I said, I'm going to keep it pretty casual. If you would like to say anything to me in the chat, feel free to add it in there, and I'll kind of check it as we go along. And we can also talk together at the end. So I just wanted to share this image. First of all, this was an image that was put together by the University of Washington for a piece they did in the alumni magazine about the center, and I thought it was really sort of captivating, some of the chaos that has been the past couple of years we've been living through. Here at the center, we really have a kind of expansive research direction. When it comes to misinformation, we have people who have been looking at misinformation around the elections. I was part of a project called the Election Integrity Partnership, which is actually continuing, which is a partnership between the University of Washington and Stanford University and a few others that's looking at election procedure related misinformation. And so we tracked a lot of the misinformation narratives that were emergent prior to the 2020 election, and what culminated in what's now known as the big lie, this idea that the election was stolen away by the Democrats, which was an interesting thing to sort of see happen in sort of slow motion. We could see the sort of seeds being laid in terms of putting a kind of seeds of doubt into the integrity of vote by mail, for example, through these sort of different election related stories across the US and beyond that talked about sort of election ballots being stolen or mail being dumped here, there, and everywhere. That kind of culminated in this undermining of people's confidence in the election result. We have been doing a similar sort of collaborative project around COVID and vaccine related misinformation called the Virality Project, that tried to track some of the narratives around the kind of effectiveness and safety of the COVID-19 vaccines, and some of the sort of anti-vaccination content, which I will be referring to a little bit later on as well. But we also have people who are working on misinformation in other countries and its impact on other communities within the US, whether that's, we have a project looking at the impact of misinformation on Vietnamese Americans. We're working with colleagues at CTAP, which is our sister center based at UNC Chapel Hill, to look at misinformation within Asian American communities within the US. And we also have graduate students and researchers at the CIP who are looking at the spread of misinformation globally. So we're keeping ourselves busy, that's for sure.
Is someone doing Ukraine?
Yeah, so we've been tracking some of the misinformation. We have one of our scholars is a international politics and international relations professor, and who concentrates actually on conspiracy theories within the sort of Russian context. So he's been looking at a lot of the kind of spread of misinformation. And I have an example actually in this slideshow at the end of some of the TikTok live videos that we've seen in Ukraine that have been sort of overlaying old audio onto new video to make it look like it's being taken in the Ukraine, but actually it's just a kind of fabricated story. So we're trying to keep it on top as much as possible with the kind of flood of information that's happening. Yeah, there's always something new coming up for sure, and trying to keep on top of it is pretty hard. So before I kind of keep going, I'm going to be using these terms misinformation, disinformation a lot, so we may as well talk about what they actually mean. The kind of umbrella term that we use within academia has turned to this information disorder. So this captures sort of all of the totality of weird and wonderfulness that's happening online. This idea that our communication or our ability to spread knowledge online is so quick and so good at connecting us with one another, but also has this sort of downside, this kind of undermining of credibility of institutional sources such as journalism or even academia, but also that speed comes with some of the lack of gatekeeping that we've anticipated or kind of come to rely on with other information sources. So information disorder sort of captures this broad definition of that. But within that, we have these three definitions. So the one that you might be kind of most familiar with is misinformation. It's actually the term I tend to use most often, and I'll tell you why in a second. There's also disinformation and malinformation. And as you can see on this kind of nice Venn diagram, there's two sort of delineating factors that we use. One is facticity, sort of how true is the information, and the other one is what is the intent behind it? Is it intended to mislead? So misinformation is kind of low facticity information. It's not correct, it's false, but it's mostly unintentionally spread. So when I say unintentional, I mean people share it kind of well-meaningly. This is the stuff we encounter every day on our Facebook feeds or, other social media sites that our friends and family might actually totally believe in, and that's why they've decided to reshare it or kind of post it to you or text it to you or whatever. There's not really like that bad intention to mislead you. They genuinely believe that this is information that is correct. Disinformation, on the other hand, is also false, but it has this intentionality about it. They intended to mislead. And the example that we usually have for this is, say, sort of foreign state intervention. Back in 2016, we had evidence that there was Russian intervention or attempts to intervene in the US election through the spreading of kind of misleading information on Facebook. And we described that as a disinformation campaign because we know that the information isn't true and we know that it was designed to mislead. And the kind of third one that we don't really kind of concentrate too much on, but is considered still under this umbrella, is malinformation. And that's actually information that is correct, but that is weaponized in a way that is trying to sort of harm others. And so the example that is on the chart here is revenge porn. So adult content that is, real, but is weaponized and spread with an intent to harm the person or intent to sort of embarrass or ridicule someone. And so that's kind of a little bit different than the other two because it has that sort of truth to it, but it is weaponized in the same way that these kind of other types of information is weaponized. And as I said, I tend to use misinformation in my own work because I think this kind of difference in intention is really hard to disentangle. So sometimes we have very obvious kind of, we can say, a foreign actor is trying to intervene in the US election. The intent is there to mislead. But for kind of our everyday sharing, it's really hard to sort of pinpoint someone's genuine intention, and mostly kind of like to give people the benefit of the doubt that, we encountering so much information on our daily basis, and we're not necessarily equipped to handle all of it. So I tend to use misinformation. So you'll hear me saying that throughout. So I want to talk about a couple of research projects that we've been doing here at the center that require me to talk about QAnon, which I would love to hear if anyone in the chat has heard about QAnon. I think it's quite a sort of a mainstream sort of topic now, unfortunately, which I'll talk about why it's sort of mainstream, but it is a sort of interesting conspiracy rabbit hole to fall down. So I'll give you a second if you want to type in the chat.
And while you're taking a drink, I think we have a couple people with microphones on. So if again, everybody could mute, please, it would be great.
Do I need to cross it?
Okay. Well, if you haven't heard, which I will be, I'm very jealous if you have not heard about QAnon at this point.
We've all heard it.
Yeah. But essentially, it's this pretty fringe conspiracy theory originally that started in the murkier ends of the internet on image sharing forums, 4chan and 8chan, which these forums tend to have little or no content moderation. They tend to be the sort of harbor some of the more extreme conversations that happen online and are a space that people tend to sort of share conspiracy theories. And it's not uncommon for people in these forums to use these anon monikers as their usernames. And so this QAnon sort of character emerged that was claiming to have high-level security access to top secret government secrets regarding corruption, and essentially was sort of positing this theory that there was this cabal of elite Democratic politicians and Hollywood celebrities and other sort of business leaders and elites that are operating a child trafficking ring or global child trafficking ring and sort of engaging in human sacrifice and some of these more sort of extreme actions. And there remains a lot of speculation actually over who Q is, this original poster. And there was recently a New York Times article, I think I have a link to it actually, I can share with you. There was a recent New York Times article that did some sort of sociolinguistic analysis and found that they think it was actually a group of people who were the original sort of posters, who were just sort of, having conversation online that ended up turning into this phenomenon that now I have to talk about on a daily basis. Let me see if I can put this link in the chat to the, I might not be able to do it. Oh, here we go. Here's the New York Times article I was just telling you about.
Thank you.
So these QAnon posts that they post online were sort of not extremely widely seen. They're heavily cryptic. They rely on these numbers and shorthand and symbolism that is designed to pull people into sort of this puzzle-like adventure of solving this mystery with them. And they span across these many different conspiracy theories, ranging from sort of 9/11 and 9/11 was an inside job sort of conspiracy theories to this elite cabal of Democratic politicians. And so what we were interested in at the center is like how this QAnon sort of theory came from this sort of dark corner of the internet to become so mainstream that we're seeing it at have these offline impacts, and also have this sort of kind of trickle down effect where even though people might not say that they believe in QAnon, they end up sort of espousing a lot of QAnon related theories. And QAnon has obviously had some very serious and very impactful offline impacts. We saw QAnon related paraphernalia and flags being flown at the January 6th insurrection. There's been sort of violent acts committed in the kind of cause of QAnon related theory, including the kind of early Pizzagate conspiracy theory where someone ended up going to a pizza shop in DC and with a gun thinking that they were going to kind of uncover this trafficking ring in the basement, of which there was not even a basement at the building. So it is having a huge impact on people's life. And actually in last year, there was a poll that found that 15% of Americans believe in some elements of this QAnon theory. And that number puts it on par with a lot of belief in many global religions. So it is having this sort of stronghold. And so what we decided to look at was one of the affiliated sort of movements within QAnon, which is the Save the Children campaign that you can see on the slide. And Save the Children, it's a British children's charity, or was a British children's charity, that was using social media, using this hashtag to just tell the people about the work that they were doing. But the online sort of conversation under this hashtag ended up getting co-opted by a lot of this QAnon content and to spread conspiracy theories around this global elite child trafficking ring. And so we wanted to understand sort of how this co-optation happened, how it ended up that this hashtag on social media ended up giving people QAnon related theories rather than, genuine information about this charity or anti-trafficking in general. And we decided to look at this conversation as it was happening on the social media site Instagram. And I've included some of the Instagram posts below that we found in our collection. And Instagram is a really interesting space for social media research, partially because it's a visual site, and so there is a lot going on in terms of people post pictures and videos, but also have comments and conversation going on. So there's a lot for a researcher to look at. But also there's this sort of ubiquitous influencer culture that has grown around the platform, where things have to be sort of presented in this visually aesthetic and pleasing way, and you have to sort of follow the right people and tag the right things. And so it's kind of the perfect place to see how this fringe conspiracy movement becomes mainstream and sort of gets the trappings of digital conversation online.
Rachel, would that be, but Instagram is not necessarily folks like everybody on this group is probably at least 65 probably. That's probably not a thing that a lot of us hang out with. So is this an age skewed data survey that you're doing?
Yeah, so most of these, so what we did was we scraped all of the data that was associated with the hashtag Save the Children and a few others. So all of the people that had posted using that. And we did an analysis of who it was. So as you said, who these posters, what kind of demographics they represent. And I'd say they're mostly, white women, probably, between the ages of 20 to 35, probably skewing that way. And actually what's interested is kind of we capture a range of people within this net. So it might be dominated by that particular demographic, but we also have, these anonymous conspiracy theory accounts where you don't really know who's behind it, but they're posting with the same hashtag. So it ended up being, as to the kind of demographic question, predominantly white women and predominantly sort of mothers as well, which when you think about sort of the moral authority of motherhood and tying it with this kind of exploitation of children that this conspiracy theory is sort of telling people is happening on this global scale, it's kind of understandable that those are the kind of people that were attracted to the movement. But it's interesting to us because it's not really the kind of people that you would expect to sort of believe in conspiracy theories. But this has ended up being sort of a gateway to bring in sort of a new group of people into sort of more conspiratorial or a sort of misinformation type information.
Well, thank you.
I think that I want to stay on this side. So here's a couple of other examples, actually. So one of the ways that this became mainstream was, I don't want to say an event, a situation that happened called the Wayfarer Scandal, which you may have heard of as well, is kind of tied into this QAnon Save the Children sort of thing. And what happened was there's a furniture retailer called Wayfarer. They mostly sell online. And people had been going on their website and saw that some of their furniture, I think it was mostly cabinets, had very high price points, $10,000 for what looked like a pretty average looking cabinet. And for some reason, people who were kind of already primed within this misinformation space decided that meant there was something more happening. There was something going on behind the scenes. And also it didn't help that the Wayfarer tend to give their furniture a name. IKEA does the same thing. You have the Billy bookcase. Wayfarer has, human names for their furniture. And so the conspiracy theory went that Wayfarer was actually selling children and they were using the cabinets as a front. And so if you bought this $10,000 cabinet, you were actually buying the child with the same name of the cabinet. And it sounds extremely far-fetched when I kind of say it in the abstract like that. But when you've been sort of immersed in this misinformation online and you're, spending every day looking at Instagram and you're starting to follow this hashtag and you're seeing this kind of content every day, these things become very familiar. And so it doesn't seem, wild. It seems very everyday. And so what we found was a lot of kind of these Instagram influencers who were like, obviously there's something going on. There's something going on at Wayfarer, and feeling like they had this kind of call, whether it's because of their identity as a mother or as a woman or just as a person in the world, to do something about it. And the doing something about it for them was using their social media platforms to, expose the truth and to sort of tell people what was happening. So a couple of these Instagram stories are on the screen here of people sort of saying, do you believe in it? And sort of also pushing these other sort of types of misinformation we see around trafficking, where you get these kind of folk stories of people saying that they had been followed in the supermarket, or someone had tied a string to their car, and this was meaningful because of X, Y, Z. And so what we were interested in finding out in this, Ray asks a question, actually, and I'll talk about it for a second. So Ray asks if Instagram have any responsibility to vet posts for accuracy, which is an excellent question. No, they do not. Social media actually legally does not have does not hold responsibility for what its users post. And there is an ongoing sort of legal argument about that. A lot of people say, if we're going to curb misinformation, we need to hold platforms responsible. But that would essentially sort of bankrupt social media platforms as we know it, and they would cease to exist. So they are obviously very adamant that they shouldn't be held responsible, but they are trying to do some things to curb it, which I'll get to in a second. But thank you for that question. I think is an important thing to qualify. No, Instagram do not control, unfortunately, any of the accuracy of the posts that people are posting. But we were really interested in sort of who was spreading this kind of misinformation. Was it all misinformation? Were there some truth in there? And what we found was it was mostly misinformation, unfortunately. And so what happens is we had this sort of online conversation happening where if you were a person on Instagram and you were kind of decided that you felt like anti-trafficking and, going against child exploitation was an important cause for you, and you wanted to access information about that, if you went down this route of looking into the Save the Children campaign, you were actually just being exposed to misinformation and to conspiracy theories that were tied to QAnon. And so actually that brings me to talk a little bit about the social media reaction to this, to the question that was just asked. So in sort of in order to curb some of this misinformation, because obviously, we all agree that we think it's a problem that people are not finding good information online, and that there should be some sort of interventions to make sure that this misinformation isn't overtaking the information landscape so that it's really difficult for us to find good information. The social media companies have been trying, I'm going to use that word very liberally, trying to intervene in misinformation. I would say that they are not particularly good at it for many different reasons, one of which is that misinformation is very engaging. So the posts that I showed you on Instagram, they're very popular posts. People like to look at those things. They like to feel like they're learning about something, even if it's not true. And so because misinformation is so engaging, it's very profitable for social media companies. So the profit logic is not necessarily aligned for them to go all in to stop the spread of misinformation on their platforms. It's also very technically difficult to do because of the amount of content and the diversity of content and the fact that we're all posting all the time, and it's this avalanche of information. So they are facing an uphill battle technically to try and intervene. But what they've tried to do with QAnon is to kind of remove it from their platforms entirely. So they take down QAnon related posts. They do a kind of mixture of human-led interventions. So if someone flags a post as being QAnon related, they'll take it down. But they also have sort of automated content moderation that relies on algorithms to detect sort of whether or not this is QAnon related and take it down. And they have a few different methods of sort of kind of controlling our interactions to try and stop the amplification of this kind of message. So they might keep the content up, but they won't prioritize it in your newsfeed, or they might not let people comment on it. They might not let certain accounts share stories or share links to other things. It's a practice that we call shadow banning. So you're allowed to use the platform, but your technical abilities on the platform have been somewhat curtailed. And it is a little bit controversial. So this is a screenshot from one of our posters within the Save the Children movement, who was sharing a lot of misinformation around QAnon and had their account restricted by Instagram. So they were unable to do certain things. They didn't feel like people were seeing their posts. And in the end, they got their account taken away from them. And then they just started a new account. It's really not that difficult. They just signed up again and started a new account. But they posted this message saying that they would, be gone in a matter of hours or days. And so there's this sort of kind of broadening ethical question over this kind of intervention to misinformation. Like, is it right to deplatform people, to take away their ability to use social media? And on, the one side, these are private companies operating private goods, and they're allowed to do whatever they want. And so if they don't want that person on their platform spreading misinformation, they're within their rights to take that person's ability to have an Instagram account away. On the other hand, we've decided that these social media spaces have become sort of public spheres for us to have both very kind of light conversation, but also kind of democratic conversations to get our news from, to talk to each other about important things that help kind of civil society run. And so because those spaces are public spheres, they sort of have responsibilities in a way, or they don't want to admit that, but they have responsibility to us to kind of have a kind of space that we can have healthy democratic conversation within. So if it's up to Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, who gets to participate in those conversations, there's a kind of a little bit of I call kind of stickiness as to whether they are the right people to be making those decisions, because these are private companies. And we've also found that there's sort of limited success with this deplatforming anyway. So this is very new, obviously. We mostly saw kind of this deplatforming, this taking away of social media accounts around the 2016 election. Obviously, Trump getting taken down from Twitter was one of the big examples. And we don't yet have enough research to tell us whether or not that actually dramatically impacted the information quality on those spaces. Taking Trump's Twitter account away was, defensible in some ways. Like, it stopped him from being able to kind of amplify misinformation around the election to millions of people, and without the, stamp of authority that comes with being president at the time. But at the same time, this is one of the leaders of the free world, and taking away their communication channels is like a very important, considerable thing that we shouldn't kind of necessarily let Twitter decide every single day. So there's a lot to be sorted out in terms of deciding how should platforms go around taking away some of this misinformation. So we did this sort of Instagram study. We're interested in misinformation around QAnon and Save the Children. But at the same time, we were working on a lot of vaccine-related projects. And one of the things that we saw in the Save the Children sort of Instagram sort of data set with this predominantly sort of younger audience was that they had found ways to monetize misinformation, so to make profit out of misinformation. And because we've been facing this looming health crisis for a few years now, where misinformation around COVID and misinformation around the vaccines has been such a sort of public health emergency, we were interested in seeing how people who were using Instagram to talk about COVID-19 and specifically to spread anti-vaccination messaging were trying to either profit from or who economically benefited from spreading that kind of information. So this second study I want to talk about is that sort of element of it, of how misinformation is not just, an information kind of battle of whether you believe in something or don't believe in something, but there's other incentives to spread misinformation online, whether that's the kind of ego boosts that comes from getting lots of likes and people turning to you as an information source, or as we find in this research, the economic benefit, how you can actually make money out of spreading misinformation. So again, we did this study on Instagram looking at, actually, I will send you another link in the chat. If I can do it. So we did another study on Instagram. where we're looking at what's been known as the disinformation dozen. So the report that I'll put in the chat here is from a center called the Center for Countering Digital Hate, and they found in a report last year 12 anti-vaccination sort of influencers or well-known anti-vaccination advocates were responsible for spreading nearly 2/3 of the misinformation around COVID. So we have this small number of people who are really influential, spreading an incredible amount of anti-vaccination content that ends up going far and wide across these different social media platforms. So we wanted to look at how they were kind of using Instagram and their influence as it spread out. So what we did was we started a kind of fake account on Instagram where we followed these accounts and ended up snowballing out, where if they recommended someone to us, we would also follow that person and see what kind of information they were sharing. And we sort of spiraled from there and ended up following all of these sort of anti-vaccination opponents on Instagram. And what we were interested in finding out is sort of, one, the messages that they were spreading, you know, what kinds of arguments are they making about the vaccine? What kinds of information are they sharing? But also this economic element, like what are they asking you to do once you know that information? And ultimately we find a lot of them are directing people to spaces that they can earn profit out of, whether that's, you know, go and buy my book on Amazon where I talk more about, you know, Fauci or vaccines, or, you know, subscribe to my newsletter for $5 a month, or even even sharing these links to these multi-level marketing schemes that sell sort of natural products or natural cleaning supplies, essential oils and things like that, where they get a cut of the profits. And so a lot of these people in this space are what we call kind of health or wellness or lifestyle influencers. They're kind of sharing content every day about their life and, you know, how they take care of themselves and the kind of foods they eat or the gym routine that they have. And then they kind of started gradually sharing sort of misinformation about the vaccine and then leading us to another website where we would buy a product that would help us. And so we kind of find this funneling pipeline happen where people build up a really significant following, and, you know, thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of people are following them on this on their Instagram accounts, that they share these messages that are kind of pro-health and extremely sort of inspirational and aspirational, and people want to kind of believe that that's how you like take care of yourself. And then they share anti-vaccination messaging that feels really compelling and trustworthy because of all of the other information that you've consumed from them. And then they direct you to the product that they're selling. So I'll give you a little example of how this worked on a particular day in our data set. So we have an account, and I've blocked out all of the details, but on the left, this person sort of shares, you know, these are all in the space of a day. They share a picture and a video of them at the gym, working out, you know, having a healthy, sustainable lifestyle. The next sort of message that they're sharing is very much sort of questioning around the vaccine and sort of the response to the COVID crisis, and sort of this idea of like there's health and there's you know, reliance on a vaccine and things like that. And then the next one, they're selling a product that this one is a beard oil that you can go and buy. But all of these tie together to be this kind of journey of like, you build trust in this person, you build a relationship with them because you're looking at their life every day online. They start sharing this information about vaccines. They are not an epidemiologist. They are not a doctor. They're not a biologist, but they share information about vaccines that you trust because you follow them every day and you like their content. And then they find a way to kind of make money off it, whether that's, you know, selling pretty much anything. Sorry. Oh, let me get back. So we've been following this kind of pathway as it happens and the kinds of tools that people are using to kind of allow this. So Instagram is what we call a walled garden. When you are on the application on your phone, you're kind of stuck on the application. They don't give you many routes to sort of click out of it. Which is kind of a good thing, but it also means that you can't engage in what we call lateral reading. You can't then, you know, double check if that's right by going somewhere else, because that requires you to come out of the app and go somewhere else. And we just don't really consume information. We tend to sort of scroll through. Because Instagram is this walled garden, they have a couple of ways that you can kind of come out of the application, one of which is this link in bio. So a lot of people have in their profile a link that gives you you know, sends you to another website where they'll have a list of all of the things that you can find out about them, whether it's like a link to their website or their LinkedIn profile or their YouTube profile or whatever. And a lot of these Instagram influencers have been using those to kind of store these links to these products that they sell. So we're trying to figure out, how do we sort of remove the ability for misinformation super spreaders to use those outside tools to make them money, while also, making sure that Instagram influencers can still exist normally, because that's the bread and butter of how Instagram makes their money ultimately. So it's trying to make this kind of balance between how do we have access to all these tools and communication things that we need without it kind of laying the groundwork for misinformation super spreaders to have, widespread access to audiences, but also ways of making money off of it. And the kind of one other sort of platform I wanted to talk about before we have a chat is TikTok, which is, we have kind of these phases of social media sites now where, Facebook is now becoming sort of, I say older, we say older, it's kind of millennial from up. So it's a big sort of lots of different generations on Facebook. But then Instagram sort of trends towards sort of younger generation. And TikTok is the latest sort of competitor that is even younger than that. So originally TikTok was a video sharing app that was aimed towards kind of 13 and up, so extremely young people. And so we're extremely worried about it when it comes to misinformation, because that's sort of the prime time that you're learning how to consume information. Hopefully you're at a good school where they're teaching you kind of critical literacy skills and media skills that you can detect whether something's true or not. But also, you're facing this new technological world where it's really easy to create things that look and feel real. And so TikTok is an interesting, if not slightly terrifying space to think about misinformation, because it's really easy to present things that feel real on this video sharing app. And so the example that's on the far left here is a live video that someone shared that was supposedly live footage of what was happening on the ground in Ukraine several weeks ago at the beginning of the conflict. And actually the video was just, blurry sort of explosions, like this kind of chaotic scene. And it actually turned out that the audio that was on top of this video was from the Beirut explosion several years ago. And the video was just, unintelligible video. But someone can quite easily combine those two things, post it on TikTok as live. So this is happening right now. And it gains all of this traction. And so if it becomes popular, it gets what we call kind of algorithmically prioritized. More and more people see it. It gets pushed to the forefront of people's news feeds because it's engaging. It's been proven to be engaging. And yet it's really hard for you in the moment when you see that video to fact check it. But you kind of come away with this impression that you're seeing exactly what's happening in Ukraine, but actually it's completely fabricated. And so one of the kind of key concerns within sort of misinformation studies at the moment is sort of how do we teach people, or even ourselves, because I saw that video and I thought it was pretty realistic too. And it was only when I saw a fact check that I kind of could disentangle it not being true. But how do we kind of equip people with the skills to be able to kind of question content when they consume it so quickly, when you're scrolling so quickly through your phone, but when it looks so realistic like that? So TikTok is the kind of new frontier in our kind of concerns about misinformation. So before we kind of conclude and have a chat, I wanted to sort of end on a sort of more, let's say, hopeful note. So misinformation is obviously a very frustrating topic. It's very frustrating for me. I get a lot of emails from people who don't think that I am telling the truth, that I am spreading misinformation myself. And so it can often feel quite like isolating to people and cause a lot of interpersonal conflict. So I like to kind of talk about how do we get people sort of out the rabbit hole? How do you stop someone from believing in misinformation? And I don't think that there's any one answer to this, otherwise I would be out of a job and I'd be very happy about it. But I do think there's some things that we can do to sort of keep the conversation going, so we don't just end up sort of being siloed into our sort of belief camps. And before I kind of dive into that, this image on the screen actually is from Reddit, which is a forum site online, and it's called QAnon Casualties. And it's become this sort of forum where people who either have loved ones who believed in QAnon or believe in QAnon can talk to each other. But it's also a lot of people on this forum who did believe in QAnon, but no longer no longer do. So they've gotten out the rabbit hole. So it's a really interesting place to see sort of what was the straw that broke the camel's back when it came to their belief in this misinformation. So it kind of, I tend to look at it because it gives me a little bit of hope that, you know, we're not sort of stuck into these misinformation sort of holes when we get into them. So as we continue our research at the CIP, we hope to kind of work towards more successful routes to getting people out of misinformation or stopping misinformation from going rampant on these social media sites like Instagram and TikTok. And so hopefully the first thing, hopefully that you kind of gather from this sort of research, that there's not sort of a person who believes in conspiracy theories or a type of person who is more likely to believe in misinformation than another. We're actually all prone to believing in misinformation, especially when it aligns with our ideological or our political views or our religious views, or just makes sense in our current worldview. And so it's important to approach people, as frustrating as it can be, approach people who are sharing misinformation with you or on your social media feeds with empathy and understanding that we're all kind of vulnerable to bad information online. And that actually that's been exacerbated in this era of social media. You know, as we've seen in that spread of QAnon across platforms, you know, these kind of predominantly young women and mothers believing in these conspiracy theories about child trafficking actually comes from a really sort of empathetic and admirable space. They want to do something to end exploitation. Unfortunately, they've kind of been exposed to so much bad information about it that they're not necessarily engaging in impactful behavior. So promoting this idea of empathy and being nice, it also means that when you're engaging with someone about a piece of misinformation, that you have to sort of really sort of lean into that empathy and not engage in personal attacks, which can be difficult because of the content of misinformation sometimes is dealing with these narratives, you know, of white supremacy or misogyny or anti-Semitism or racism. But it's important to sort of understand why someone might believe in it. Why is it important to them that this is true? Often our belief in misinformation also comes from a sense of instability, with the personal or structural. So uncertain situations are kind of prime for the spread of misinformation. And we have kind of constantly been in a state of uncertainty for the past few years with the pandemic and various conflicts and political instability. So there's a lot of reason as to why someone might believe in misinformation, and your conversation should be about kind of interrogating the why rather than just sort of attacking someone for their belief in something. Practically, we ask that people kind of embrace this truth sandwich method. One of the unfortunate things about fact checking is that we have to repeat the misinformation whilst debunking it. So it ends up sort of like keeping the lie sticky in someone's head rather than the truth. So researchers kind of advocate this truth sandwich. So you start with the fact check, the truth, and then you explain why it means that the misinformation is wrong, and then you repeat the truth again. So you bookend the fact check on both sides, and we hope that that kind of like elevates it in your memory and it makes you more likely to believe it. Karen, thank you for your question. I'll get to that in just one second. In addition to sort of this truth sandwich approach, you have to kind of provide counter evidence rather than just your opinion. The difficulty is that, as like you may have found in your own personal situations, that even if you provide someone with what you think is an authoritative news source that debunks or fact checks the piece of misinformation they are sharing, they might not have trust in that news source. So I tend to also say, here's a fact check from PolitiFact or the New York Times. I believe that it's authoritative because of these reasons. So you're also kind of suggesting the truth of the producer of the fact check, while also providing an authoritative source about it. And the final thing I would say is that if you're trying to sort of fact check someone or trying to get them to not believe in misinformation, is that you're not going to change their mind in a single conversation. So your goal of the conversation is not to make them not believe in that misinformation. Your goal in the conversation is to get them to want to have a second conversation with you. So it's more about sort of building a relationship of trust with someone. Using that relationship of trust to sort of interrogate why it's important that they believe in that information, why it's important to them that information is true, and having sort of those continued conversations about why the piece of information or misinformation that they presented to you is not as factual as it should be. So I think the overall message is obviously be kind, but also, that it takes time to get people out of a rabbit hole, and that we are all prone to believing in misinformation, and that there's no sort of one type of conspiracy theorist. Unfortunately, we're all prone to conspiracy theories these days.
Especially if you're all sitting around the table at Easter, and there's been some champagne and mimosas drunk, and then it's you get into the arguments about.
Yeah, I think a rule should be, if post mimosas, maybe just don't try. Maybe wait for coffee hour. I want to, we can sort of have a general chat, and I can stop my sharing so we can see all your faces, but I wanted to just address Karen's question in the chat. So Karen says most things in life are not black and white. We all know human trafficking exists, and how would people know whether Save the Children is completely bogus or just some things are bogus, for example? That's actually a really good question. A lot of misinformation thrives because it contains this kernel of truth. So the reason that, the Save the Children movement emerged out of this QAnon campaign feels very kind of familiar and truthful is because child trafficking is a real thing. There is a whole, industry of anti-trafficking organizations working to end this kind of exploitation. And so it's really muddy as to be able to kind of figure out what's true and what's false. What we actually did within this project, after we looked at Instagram, we had the same question that you've just asked, Karen. It's like, it's so difficult. Like, how do we know where to look? And so what we did was we interviewed people who work in anti-trafficking organizations about the impact that QAnon has had on their work, and kind of how they try and fact check it. And what they said is, mostly that just social media sites are not the right place to be having this kind of conversation. This topic is extremely nuanced. It's extremely complicated. It's very emotional. It's a lot like all these very complicated feelings that are really difficult to sum up in a Facebook post or a tweet or, however we communicate on social media. And so their kind of main thing was like, don't go to social media to look for information about anti-trafficking. If you want to find out genuine information, you need to look towards sort of more institutional sources of knowledge. So look towards these anti-trafficking organizations. And a lot of them now actually have on their websites these kind of primers or research that they've been doing on QAnon that explicitly says, like, this is what QAnon says about trafficking. This is what's true in it, and this is what's false in it. So they are the best placed people to be doing that very complicated work, but it just doesn't kind of condense well into social media. So not all conversations should be had on social media, I think, is the answer to that question. And Bill also asked a question about what sources do you suggest for fact checking. There is a lot of people who are doing fact checking now, which is great. There's PolitiFact, I can't speak today. PolitiFact, who's a great organization. There's an organization out of the University of Pennsylvania that might actually be PolitiFact. I'll put it in the chat in a second when I remember the name of it. And a lot of mainstream media organizations, which, have differing levels of trust. People obviously have built up a lot of distrust in mainstream media, but a lot of media organizations that do have the resources, the journalistic skills, and the professionalism to undertake fact checking are doing explicit fact checking when it comes to things like presidential debates or election related misinformation. So looking to the news site that you trust, you'll often find that they do explicit fact checking coverage now too. Let me stop sharing so I can see some faces. I can answer Chris's question too. Chris asks, are actual political party leaders turning to social media to influence voters? Yes. Social media is becoming sort of a key campaign communication tool for all types of political leaders. There's many good things about that. It gives people access to their political leaders in a way that we haven't had before. There's a level of accountability that we haven't had before because you can have these communication channels that we didn't previously have. But also social media brings with it a certain style of communication that is, leaning more towards the sort of sound bites that we didn't really like to hear on cable news as it is, and these kind of clipped sort of responses to things. So again, it means that the kind of communication that people have on social media is not necessarily like has the depth and the nuance that we require for democratic conversation. So whilst it is a useful way for people to have access to their leaders, it's not necessarily a really substantive medium for us to be able to have difficult conversations on it.
I've got a question. You've been doing a great job of focusing on some specific issues and specific examples. And I'm wondering what kind of research you or others are doing on a more general level. The attack on social media, the attack on traditional media, the attack, get more and more people who are attacking, and they'll use air quotes, fact checking, as if it's a silly kind of thing to do. Is there any research on the effects of these general kinds of attacks?
Actually, so my background is in journalism studies, and I started looking at social media because of just that I was interested in this growing distrust in mainstream news media or, traditional news media sources, and had that question of, what happens when that trust is undermined? Where do people go for information if they don't trust their nightly news or their local newspaper? And overwhelmingly, they go to social media. So what we find is this growing distrust in traditional news media is driving people online, and also the lack of kind of gatekeeping of journalistic process that doesn't exist online. Anyone can post anything, can claim to be a journalist or claim to be whoever they want, means that you can Google something and find exactly what you want to read, rather than when you read a newspaper you might not necessarily agree with it. There's this sort of sense of conflict, but distrust is not just confined to media. We find distrust in academia, distrust in science in particular has driven COVID-19, sort of vaccination hesitation in particular has driven attacks on scientists and on kind of key public health officials. And a lot of the research that we've been doing at the center is the ways that misinformation is weaponized for those attacks. So with the COVID-19, for example, people don't necessarily believe me, for example, when I say something about vaccination misinformation, because they might not trust in academia. They may think it's a liberal institution and that I am paid by the government, not enough money to tell people to go get a vaccination. And because there's that lack of trust, it means that anything that I try and do fact checking wise is just going to fall completely flat. So until we address the trust problem, we can't address the misinformation problem. So a lot of sort of broader research is trying to look at that, sort of how do we rebuild trust in our core institution, what is necessary. And I think the difficulty of that really lies in there's not necessarily an incentive for us to trust in institutions in the same ways that we've seen before. We are extremely sort of tribal in our political ideology, in our general ideology, and we now have access to whatever information we want. So we can build an information diet that is, as I said, it doesn't cause any conflict. It just tells us what we want to hear. It reifies our worldviews in ways that feel comfortable. And so if someone says, how do we rebuild trust in the mainstream news? The answer that we mostly get from people who have that distrust is, you can't. Why would I believe the New York Times? Or why would I believe CNN? It's kind of it's worrying to think that we might have gone past the point of return when it comes to rebuilding trust in our institutions. But that's a very media specific example. I really hope that we can rebuild trust in academia, for example. I think that academia and scientific process hopefully is, something that with enough sort of transparency from academia and transparency within science, we can make inroads to make people trust in those processes again.
Once upon a time, we had trust generally in, I guess maybe not so much in institution, but in personalities. If Walter Cronkite or Eric Sevareid said it, you had a lot of confidence that you were getting it from a good source. Any sense that they had a particular kind of style or personality, or that building trust in institutions might come through a personality?
this is that I love this question because this was what I wrote my dissertation about. I think, and I was just there was a really great conference the other week at Harvard. They have the Shorenstein Center there is another misinformation center doing great work. And we had this conversation about Walter Cronkite, actually, because we were talking about Joe Rogan, the podcaster who spreads a lot of misinformation and has millions of listeners every week listen to his podcast. And I think that we maybe think about it a little wrong. You know, I get asked all the time, you know, well, we need a Walter Cronkite. We don't have these trusted figures anymore. And I think we do have trusted figures. People trust in Joe Rogan a lot. There's millions of people who listen to his podcast every week. Unfortunately, what we've had is this sort of disentangling of trust from professional authority. So we trusted Walter Cronkite because of his professionalism, his journalistic credibility, his commitment to, you know, ethical and, you know, truth and ethical journalism. And that was where our trust was built. We trusted him because of those things. Now we have trust in figures, not necessarily because of any of those things, or any of those good things, professionalism or anything. We have trust in them because they say what we want to hear, or they have a popular platform, and so we think we should trust them because they have this many likes or this number under their name that says they're X amount of, you know, popularity. And so because of that decoupling, the trust becomes very sort of superficial and flimsy. And that person can leverage that trust to spread any kinds of misinformation. Whereas, you know, if we had a Walter Cronkite suddenly sharing misinformation on the nightly news, people would definitely question it. They wouldn't necessarily like take it on as being, oh, Cronkite said it, so it's true. They would be like, this doesn't feel right because that's not their usual style, or that's not how they usually present the news. So I think it's not really a problem that we don't have trusted figures, is that our trust looks a lot different than it used to be. It's not as kind of substantive as it once was.
I want to ask you whether or not you think that the rise of social media, of course, has coincided with the drop of media, although we do have a lot of things that the things like Axios and almost every state has some sort of new media emerging. It's not just the plain old newspapers anymore. But how does this, your thoughts about the drops in circulation and drops in newspapers closing, affected people's ability to actually get good information where they maybe would trust it? I mean, if they say that West Salem beat Bangor West Salem girls basketball team beat Bangor 90-78 in the paper, you'll believe it. But when you look at the paper and you say the city council is arguing about whether or not this new development goes in, you don't know if you still believe this or not, or it may not even be covered. So you know, as an old journalist, for me, the same thing. As you lose a number of newspapers, then people don't know what to trust. If you can't start trusting locally, then how do you ever figure out who to trust broadly?
Yeah, social media kind of economically devastated journalism as an industry. Right. The advertising dollars that were once, you know, subsidizing professional journalism went to social media, and so it's really difficult to keep the lights on in a newsroom. It's incredibly difficult to run any sort of journalistic endeavor. So there's that economic side of things, that social media came along and it was a tornado economically for journalism. And there's also, you know, it gave us access to the tools of journalism at our fingertips. You know, people will take a live video of something and put it on Twitter, and they're suddenly a journalist. So you can claim to that because you have the tools. And there are some ways in which that is a good thing. You know, journalism was once a very sort of elite, extremely white, extremely male industry, and this has disrupted it somewhat. And so people can, you know, communicate about things that are important to them in a way that journalism once didn't cover. And that is something that journalism has to deal with as well, of like becoming more relevant and becoming, you know, reflecting the societies that it's supposed to represent. But yeah, it's with that economic downfall has brought, this parallel level of distrust. And I think that you're kind of focused on local journalism in particular is really important, because it's almost like local journalism is like our training ground for building up relationships of trust with the news that we consume. That local journalism has this, immediate relevance to us because it's about our immediate locality, but also we can kind of fact check it a little bit more easily because we have access to the locality that we live in. And so we consume our local news and we build up a relationship of what news should look like. But now, local news is becoming more sparse, where a lot of people live in what we call news deserts, where they don't have access to a local organization. We're also seeing the kind of conglomerization of local news, where they're getting taken over by these sort of national chains that are just eating up local outlets. And then instead of actually reporting on areas of the local area, they're just churning out sort of wire articles that may or may not be relevant. And so we're really seeing this degradation of local news, and with it, this kind of removal of that training ground of trust. If you don't grow up reading the news about your local area, you're not really kind of getting into that habit of kind of actively consuming news. Whereas instead you're going online and you sort of have this ambient consumption where news is kind of everything and nothing at the same time. Like your Facebook feed is, a post from a cousin about something that happened to them in their life. And then the next thing is a story from the New York Times. Everything becomes very muddled, and it's really hard for us to actually build good practices of media literacy and engaged reading in the news, and therefore build that trust in it. So I think that a lot of, research and sort of activity and philanthropy in the news space has been directed at local news for a really good reason, to try and rebuild that infrastructure so we can rebuild trust at that kind of basic level and start building from there. And it's really amazing. I've seen a lot of really great sort of local, so in Washington in particular, I'm pretty new to Washington. I only moved here a couple of years ago, but there's a lot of really great sort of highly local news organizations who are trying to fill that gap that they've seen that there hasn't been a local news outlet there for a while. So, normally sort of retired journalists are kind of coming back into the business and restarting these local journalistic outlets to try and fill that hole. But it requires a lot of resource, a lot of sort of philanthropic work, a lot of sort of academic research. And so hopefully that's something that will grow in the future and be sort of a bit of a beacon of hope in the situation that we currently have.
I really like that line that you used, information diet. Now, see, I think I could talk with people who I disagree with along that line, because if you think about your diet, what you eat, and if you're getting a lot of sugar, you're eating a lot of stuff that's just, it's not healthy. It's everything's processed. I mean, take a look. It's sort of like if you take a look at the ingredients. And so the same thing when you're asking someone to drill down, well, where did you get that information? And is it from the Prospect or the National Review or New York Times or the Post? So look at the contents, as you're doing it. Is it really fruit juice, or is it just sugar added to it? And so I like that approach to it in terms of a way to talk about this with people about what are they eating? What is their information diet? I've never heard that. I really like that phrase a lot.
I think that sometimes we have this a natural reaction when someone shares something we don't agree with, of wanting to tell them why it's wrong and convince them. But I think a really compelling strategy is actually asking them to convince you. So why do they believe in it? Why is it that when they go on this website, it's trustworthy to them? How do they know that it's orange juice and not sugar? And I think when you put the onus on the other person, it makes the kind of cogs turn a little bit, because they've got to convince you now. They decided to share this information, so now they got to prove to you why it's right. It's a little bit less combative than saying you're wrong and here are the reasons that you're wrong. Just saying, tell me why you're right, and then we can talk about those reasons.
I like that. Is this happening in London and England as much as, what do you feel about back home about this stuff?
It's I'd love to say it was an American problem and just leave it there, but no. Misinformation is a kind of a global issue, and even sort of the QAnon stuff. QAnon is inherently American. It's very sort of American flavor. It's about this, person who has access to the American government and talking about the downfall of the Democratic Party has gained significant traction across Europe. We saw a lot of COVID anti-lockdown protests happening in London, in Germany, in Paris, from people who are, didn't believe COVID was a thing, or they don't agree with the government's reaction or lockdowns, using sort of QAnon related slogans and, waving QAnon flags and that slogan of where we go one, we go all, we see all the time over Europe. This sense of sort of solidarity, this kind of populist movement of solidarity. So it's definitely, unfortunately, not just an American issue. I think, in the UK, we had our Brexit vote several years ago that was entirely tainted by misinformation and top-down misinformation, misleading claims that were produced by government officials, by people who were orchestrating the Leave campaign and the Ford campaign, that ended up being sort of the crux of why some people decided to leave. There was a very widespread figure about how much money that the UK would save daily that would go to the NHS and National Health Service. That was completely, pulled out of nowhere. It was completely like nonsense figure. And yet it was on the side of buses, it was on campaign flyers. And then one of the, not necessarily the primary reason, but one of the significant reasons that a lot of people gave as to why they voted to leave the EU was that they believed we would save a lot of money that would go to strengthen our health service. And so it's this kind of top-down misinformation from government leaders, which is happening in the US as well, that ends up being, deciding political campaigns. It has an incredible amount of impact. And now we have, our leave from the EU has been extremely messy, partially because we're massively ill-equipped for it, but also due to the pandemic and other things. But a lot of people have been dissatisfied because they voted to leave because they thought that they would be doing a good thing for their country and that they would be strengthening their infrastructure. And that has not happened. So it's not necessarily like a question of they shouldn't have voted to leave. It's that they didn't get what they wanted. And democracy is not necessarily about picking the thing that I want them to pick. It's about picking the thing that they believe in and that they have rationalized through, access to information, accurate information. And that did not happen around Brexit because of misinformation. So it's definitely a problem, and one that I think no countries can avoid, unfortunately, because it's a good political strategy. Now we've decided, we throw the term post-truth around a lot, where we're like, the truth no longer matters, which I'm kind of skeptical about. I think the truth always matters, but misinformation is an incredibly powerful political tool, and people who are in government or want to be in government know that. And so it is compelling to some to use misinformation to try and get themselves into political power, to get them a political outcome, and that is happening globally.
Could you talk a bit about the Ukraine? There we're getting information or misinformation that's integral to armed conflict. And it seems like, but maybe it isn't, it seems like that's different than misinformation or disinformation on more domestic kinds of issues, something that doesn't involve military conflict.
Yeah.
And that seems to be an important kind of concern, especially when the issue is, well, the Russian troops really aren't doing as well as they thought they would do. That's one line. Well, how true is that? How do we know that? Where do you fact check something like that, as opposed to, the Russians have this strategy and they're pursuing it very ruthlessly and successfully.
Yeah. I'm not a Ukraine expert, so I can't talk to the kind of political intricacies, but what has been interesting and kind of obviously concerning about this particular conflict is we're seeing how difficult it is to assess information in real time when we have incredible access to information that we never had before. Conflicts of yore, we would wait until it was reported on, and we would get most of our information from, intelligence sources that were willing to talk on record, or that we would have people on the ground reporting on various different sort of newspapers would have foreign bureaus and have people on the ground who were reporting. Now we don't have those. A lot of the time these foreign bureaus have closed down because they're economically very difficult to sustain. But instead we have everyone on the ground with access to a cell phone and the ability to communicate. And what happens is this kind of barrage of information with no kind of gatekeeping, as I've talked about before. And so our ability to sort of fact check is basically non-existent. And in parallel with that, we have extremely intelligent disinformation campaigns that are run by states. So we know that every country engages in this kind of information warfare. Propaganda is as old as time, and now propaganda can happen on social media. But it's hard to know. There was a story on Twitter a couple of weeks ago about a Russian journalist who held up a sign. You might have seen it. Held up a sign in the background of a Russian recording, and we saw it play out on Twitter. And honestly, I have no idea the veracity of it, because we saw it play on Twitter. People post this image of this reporter who's holding up a sign saying they're lying to you in Russian and also in English in the background of a news broadcast supposedly in Russia. And immediately there's division over whether or not it's true. People kind of trying to do the normal sort of investigative reporting of like why this person might be writing in English is kind of questionable, or who is this person? Are they actually a journalist? Where are they now? Are they, have they been arrested by the Russian officials? And it just sort of descends into chaos and conspiratorial thinking, because it then becomes like, okay, well, is this a play by the Russian state to kind of fabricate a certain move for next? And I think what that kind of shows us is that we're in this real period of informational insecurity, where we have more access to everything than ever before, and it leads to less knowledge. So there's a difference between information and knowledge. Social media is really good at spreading information. It's not necessarily good at spreading knowledge, and that's what we're missing. That kind of how do we kind of fact check or do this work on the ground to find out the facts of the matter. And we do know strategies to do that, but unfortunately, we've been kind of conditioned now by this access that we have to know things immediately. And so it's not necessarily about being right, it's about being first. And we're more prone to believe the first thing that we hear than necessarily the correction that comes later or the thing that we have to wait for. So it's not a very compelling answer, unfortunately, I'm sorry. We really don't have the really good tools to be able to, at speed, tell someone whether something's true or not. And actually, that's not necessarily what we're looking for in information. It's not whether it's true or not, it's whether it's useful to us. And so we end up sort of kind of even fixating. I find myself doing it. Obviously, I have kind of a view of the morality of this conflict. And so I'm gravitating towards information that is saying that, Russia's not doing as well, or that, this heartwarming story about something that's happening in Ukraine that shows the kind of the humanity and the longevity of the people there, so we're just prone to searching out and seeking that information that makes us feel better about about hopefully a resolution to the conflict as quick as possible. And so I just don't think that we're well equipped to do that fact checking, and our information environment is definitely not well equipped to allow us to do it. So that's not very hopeful. I saw a couple of things in the chat that I should tend to. Mike posted the quote from Goebbels, which I see a lot, about the truth as being the greatest enemy to the state. I don't love that I have to see this quote all the time, but I understand it, that it's pretty apt for the kind of conditions that we're living through. And Ginny asks, what can we learn from people who deprogram people who have been convinced to believe in their cult leader? Which is a really interesting question. I think that we want to believe that there's a kind of like come to God moment when it comes to disbelief in a conspiracy theory, that there's suddenly like a moment where you go like, I'm wrong. Like everything I've believed in is a lie, and my belief in QAnon or my belief in this cult leader is completely divorced from reality. But it's not as simple as that kind of come to God moment. It's usually sort of a gradual sort of chipping away at that sort of network of beliefs that is important to you. what is really difficult about pulling people out of, whether it's a cult or like a conspiracy theory or even just a piece of misinformation, that it's not necessarily just about the information and your belief in that information. It's about the world that exists around it as well. So the cult deprogramming is a really good example for this, because it's like the social life that exists. Like you or your friends are people who are in this cult. With these online conspiracy theories, like people build relationships around them. They go online and they chat with people and they build really sincere, real relationships. And so when you're asking someone to stop believing that misinformation, you're asking them to do a really big thing, because you're also asking them to sort of break away from that kind of social life that's attached to it, break away from the kind of individual ego that was attached to it. Maybe they believed in that kind of cult or that piece of misinformation or QAnon because it made them feel special or smart or intelligent, all these things. So we can't necessarily fact check people out of those social elements or those individual ego elements. We have to provide them with their needs elsewhere. And so a lot of kind of cult deprogramming is not just about sort of saying that you shouldn't believe in this particular worldview. It's providing someone with kind of an alternative that is grounded in reality, that gives them the things that they need, or the things that we all need, that isn't attached to that cult. And it's the same thing for misinformation. It's not just about, the reason fact checking doesn't work because it doesn't necessarily speak to all of those different elements, that if we're asking someone to stop believing in something, we have to give them something else to believe in. We have to give them the kind of social world around it. We have to give them the ego boost around it as well. And then that helps us kind of get people out. So the QAnon casualty forum that I was telling you about, that is kind of a way of doing that you're no longer kind of going to these weird forums talking about QAnon, getting your daily sort of social boost from that interaction. You're now getting it from this other space, and this other space is not attached to misinformation. It's more grounded in reality. And so it provides someone sort of a gateway out of it. So I think that that's one of the kind of important things that we learn about deprogramming, is that it's not just about the information, it's about the whole kind of social world that goes with that information as well.
And of course, if you were a January 6th protester or insurrectionist, you could have an intervention by the federal government that then has you at every one of your one of these court cases where they say, I was misled. I thought this was true. I thought I was misled. I followed, I'll say, Trump, the cult. And now they're saying, because they've been arrested and they're going to be facing some prison time or jail time, then they're saying I was misled. And then they have turned around with that kind of intervention, at least when it's that abrupt, maybe.
Yeah. And we don't really necessarily live in a society where we allow people to change their minds. We kind of demonize people who don't think the same as us, which means that it's a really kind of big step for someone to change their mind, because they have to, do the I admit I was wrong and get the I told you so's. And so, when we're talking about especially kind of trying to get people to overcome vaccine hesitancy, a lot of it is about disentangling the reasons why that hesitancy exists. What kind of information are they consuming? Like, is it this anti-vaccination content that we're seeing online? But also just giving them the space of being like, it is completely normal and not a big deal if you change your mind. Like, you're allowed to, which is not something that we're particularly good at doing. I think that the January 6th example is kind of interesting to me, because it kind of tests the limits of my empathy when it comes to misinformation. Like, we want people to take sort of ownership over, their decisions and their lives and things like that. But we also realize that we live in a world where it's very easy to fall into these rabbit holes and to be misled by particularly like global leaders who have access to, a huge bully pulpit. And I feel like I get kind of tested in my patience a little bit sometimes when it comes to these things, because a lot of the times we believe in misinformation because it reifies the worldview that we already hold. And so misinformation often is extremely problematic. It's, we see a lot of transphobic misinformation, we see a lot of misogynistic misinformation, all sorts of isms attached to misinformation. And people believe it because they already sort of held those kind of views already. So it's about, allowing people to change their mind, but also knowing that, you have some accountability. You are going to be, you're in a world where it's easy for you to fall into these misinformation rabbit holes, but there should be some accountability, as I'm sure with these January 6th court cases, there is definitely going to be some accountability, but that you have been misled and you're in an information system where it's easy to be misled, but there's a reason why misinformation is sticky to you. It's because you held those kind of views already, and sometimes there needs to be an accountability for holding those views at the same time. But it's very difficult to disentangle all those things.
So in the circles you run in there, I assume that you talk a lot or think a lot about what's the next step in social media. I mean, now it's matured quite a bit. As you say, Facebook is sort of quaint. Instagram, TikTok. Now, of course, you had Parler and Signal and Trump's own thing he's starting. Do you, as you guys sit around talk and look at the future about what social media is, do you see these kind of behemoths and other things coming up as big? Is there room for new things? I mean, Parler and Signal and whatever Trump's doing are going to be, I assume, will be slivers of a certain thing. But Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, what do you see? What's the word as you guys think about this?
Well, I mean, TikTok was an interesting sort of rise, like huge rise in popularity, and we're not I'm not quite sure if that would have been the same way had it not been for the pandemic and everyone is inside and looking for something to do. And here is a short video platform that provides them with endless amounts of scrolling. So I think the pandemic did play a huge part in its popularity, but it did offer something slightly different that the other platforms weren't doing. And so one of the reasons it became so big is because it actually offered something different that we wanted. Whereas a lot of these kind of alt platforms that we call them, these Parlers or, Truth Social or whatever it is that comes next, are doing the same thing as the major platforms, but, offering these spaces that don't have moderation, that are specifically designed for people who are going to get kicked off of Facebook for talking about QAnon, and they want a space to go and do that. And their space for growth in those is limited because that's not all of us. Most of you are on social media for connection, for, entertainment, leisure, passing time, whatever it is. And so those kind of platforms don't necessarily feed that desire as much. And so they're just not prone to growth in the same way. When it comes to predicting what's next, I don't know, it's interesting. I'm continuously surprised as to what happens. But I do think there is some kind of cyclical nature to the internet and our desires on the internet. The sort of the first generation that grew up with the internet, which is my generation, the millennial generation, massive oversharers. We put anything online. And now we're seeing the next generation come out, the Gen Zs, caring a lot more about their digital privacy, knowing the consequences of oversharing. Although maybe TikTok TikTok rewards oversharing. So that might actually just completely diminish my point entirely. But I think we kind of learn lessons as the internet grows as to how much we want to share online and how we want to connect. And so what's becoming incredibly popular now is kind of your closed messaging systems like WhatsApp, which is obviously owned by Facebook, but that you can kind of just, message. I use it to kind of message with my friends back in Europe a lot, and people in America don't use it as much, but it is extremely popular outside of the US. And I feel like that's a kind of reaction to that. I don't want everything to be public. I want to be able to communicate privately. So whatever comes next is like filling whatever went wrong for the first one. And I'm hopeful that it is, tending more towards sort of good knowledge building and public deliberation, and that we're kind of centering that as being the goals that we want in our social media rather than engaging content. We want to connect with one another and have difficult conversations, but I don't know how that works structurally. How do we build a site that is more prone to that? Because if any of you are online for even a second, you see how quickly conversation decays. I am on Facebook and I usually use it. I'm in Washington, beautiful state. I'm a member of a couple of hiking groups on Facebook. And even in a hiking group, someone will post a message and immediately it will descend into, the comment section will be, everyone is just arguing with one another. People are sharing bad information. Everyone's angry. And you're just like, maybe that's just human nature. And some of it is a technical problem, some of it is a technology problem, and some of it's just human nature. And we shouldn't be connecting at scale in that kind of way.
Well, Rachel, we're at the ending hour here. This has just been totally delightful. I really appreciate your time and your energy and your research and your information with it. I'm so happy that as an old journalist, handing this off to a new generation of people like you who are looking at this and thinking seriously and finding ways to think hard about it. Dennis, you want to wrap us up?
Oh, I think you just did a marvelous job of wrapping it up. I really appreciate what you've presented and brought for us, Rachel. It's I think a lot of us have been thinking about these issues, but you put it in a great perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, good luck with everything, and we'll be watching your career and your publications. Okay, and we can follow you on Twitter, right?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at Rachel E. Moran is my name. Or you can find the work that I'm doing on the website of the Center for an Informed Public, which is based out of the University of Washington. If you just Google our name, you'll find us. And we have a newsletter that we send out every month that will tell you all of the research that we've been doing and all of the media things that we've been doing.
Oh, well, I will certainly do that. I'm sure you'll have a number of followers after this. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody else. I'm going to sign off.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
And we'll see everybody in 2 weeks, a fortnight, as they would say, and talk about sports and injuries, right?
Yeah, and mental health with sports with Monte Ball. Yes.
Right.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye now.